She walked into my life when I was living someone else's dream. That night, she made me choose between the life I had built and the person I had forgotten how to be. He had always been the kind of person who liked things organized. His apartment was clean, his schedule was predictable, and his life followed a pattern that made sense. Every Sunday evening, he'd video call his girlfriend who lived 3 states away. They'd been together for 3 years and she'd moved for a job opportunity 2 years ago. At first, the distance was supposed to be temporary. 6 months, they said, maybe a year at most. But temporary had a way of becoming permanent when nobody had the courage to ask the hard questions. Their conversations had changed over time. In the beginning, they'd talk for hours, missing each other desperately, counting down the days until the next visit. Now their calls lasted maybe 30 minutes. They'd discuss work, bills, whose turn it was to book the next flight. The conversations felt more like business meetings than love. Still, he told himself this was normal. Long distance was hard. Everyone said so. It was late October when she moved into the apartment across the hall. He noticed her immediately because she was carrying a massive canvas up the stairs by herself, cursing softly when it banged against the wall. He offered to help, and she looked at him with these dark, intelligent eyes and said, "You sure you can handle it?" He wasn't used to people challenging him like that, even in small ways. Most people in his life were polite, reserved. She was different, direct, a little wild around the edges. Her name was something artistic and flowing, and she taught painting at the university where he was finishing his graduate work. They'd see each other in the hallway sometimes, exchange small talk about the weather or the broken elevator. She always seemed amused by something, like she was in on a joke nobody else understood. He kept his distance. He had a girlfriend. He had a plan. There was no room in his organized life for complications. Then November came, and with it the first real cold snap of the season. He came home from the library one Tuesday night to find his apartment freezing. The heat was out. He called the landlord, who sounded annoyed and said it would take at least 3 days to get someone out to fix the boiler. Some of the units still had heat, apparently. Just luck of the draw which radiators were working. He bundled up in extra layers and tried to sleep. Around 11, there was a knock at his door. She stood there in an oversized sweater and pajama pants, her arms wrapped around herself. "Please tell me you have heat," she said. Her teeth were actually chattering. He did. His radiator was working fine. She looked at him hopefully. "Can I crash on your couch? I know it's weird. I know we barely know each other, but I'm actually freezing over there." He hesitated. It felt wrong somehow, like crossing a line, but she looked genuinely cold, and what was he supposed to say? "No, go freeze in your apartment?" "Sure," he said. "Let me grab you some blankets." She settled onto his couch with a grateful sigh, wrapped in his extra comforter. He made them both tea, planning to just give it to her and go to his room. But she started talking, asking about his research, telling him about a painting she was working on. And somehow, before he knew it, it was past midnight and they were deep in conversation about things that actually mattered. She told him about her life. How she'd been engaged a year ago to someone she'd been with since college. How she'd realized one day that she was marrying him because it was expected, not because she wanted to. How she'd called it off 3 months before the wedding and moved across the country to start over. "Everyone thought I was crazy," she said, staring into her tea. Maybe I was. But I couldn't shake this feeling that I was about to spend the rest of my life living someone else's dream. He didn't know what to say to that. It hit too close to something he didn't want to examine. She asked about him. His research, his plans, his life. He talked about his work, his theories, the book he wanted to write someday. She listened in a way people rarely did, asking real questions, challenging his assumptions. It felt good. He couldn't remember the last time someone had really been curious about his thoughts. Then she asked casually, "So, are you seeing anyone?" The question caught him off guard. He should have mentioned his girlfriend earlier. The fact that he hadn't felt like a lie of omission. "Yeah," he said. "She's in Boston. Has been for 2 years. Something shifted in her expression. Not disappointment exactly, more like understanding. She nodded slowly. "Long distance. That must be hard." "It is," he admitted, and realized it was the most honest thing he'd said about his relationship in months. They talked until almost 3 in the morning. When she finally said she should try to sleep, there was this moment where they just looked at each other. He felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. That spark of connection. That sense of possibility. He went to bed confused. Lying in the dark, he could hear her breathing softly in the other room. His girlfriend's photo was on his nightstand, smiling at him from a beach vacation they'd taken years ago. They looked happy in that picture. He wondered when they'd stopped being happy and started just going through the motions. The heat came back on 2 days later, but something had shifted between him and his neighbor. They started running into each other more. Or maybe they were both just making excuses to be in the hallway at the same time. Coffee became a regular thing. Twice a week they'd meet at the cafe downstairs. He told himself it was just friendship. Neighbors being friendly. Nothing wrong with that. But he thought about her constantly. The way she laughed. The way she saw the world differently than anyone he'd ever met. How talking to her felt easy and exciting at the same time. His girlfriend noticed something was different on their Sunday calls. "You seem distracted," she said one evening. "Is everything okay?" "Just stressed about the dissertation," he lied. Or half-lied. He was stressed about his dissertation. But that wasn't why he seemed distracted. She accepted the explanation because it was easier than digging deeper. They'd both gotten good at accepting easy explanations. He knew he was playing with fire. He knew that whatever was developing with his neighbor wasn't just friendship, no matter what he told himself. But he couldn't seem to stop. Every conversation pulled him further from the life he'd built and closer to something he couldn't quite name. One night, walking back from coffee, she stopped in the hallway between their doors. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure. Are you happy?" The question hung in the air between them. It was such a simple question. It should have been easy to answer. But he stood there, key in hand, and realized he didn't know. "I don't know," he finally said. She nodded like she'd expected that answer. That's honest, at least. She went into her apartment and he went into his. He sat on his couch, the same couch where she'd slept that first night, and stared at the wall. He thought about his girlfriend, about their carefully laid plans for a future that felt more theoretical than real. He thought about his neighbor, about how alive he felt when they talked. He thought about happiness and whether he'd forgotten what it felt like. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, knowing that something was going to have to change. You can only ignore the truth for so long before it forces itself into the light. He just didn't know yet how much that truth was going to cost him. 3 weeks passed, and they fell into a rhythm that felt both natural and dangerous. Coffee twice a week had turned into almost every day. Long conversations in the hallway turned into longer conversations in one apartment or the other. They'd talk about everything except the one thing that was becoming impossible to ignore. His girlfriend called every Sunday like clockwork. He'd answer. They'd talk about their weeks, make vague plans for Christmas. She'd tell him about her job, her friends, her life in Boston. He'd tell her about his research, carefully editing out all the parts that involved his neighbor. The lying by omission was getting harder. Every time he hung up the phone, he felt this weight in his chest that wouldn't go away. His neighbor invited him to an art show at a gallery downtown. Her work was being featured. He knew he shouldn't go. It felt like crossing another invisible line, but he heard himself saying yes anyway. The night of the show, he stood in the gallery looking at her paintings, and something clicked into place. Her work was raw and honest in a way that made him uncomfortable. She painted human connection, loneliness, desire, the gap between what people show the world and what they really feel. One painting in particular stopped him cold. 2 figures barely touching, the space between them charged with everything unsaid. He stared at it and felt like she'd somehow painted the inside of his head. She found him standing there. "What do you think?" she asked. "It's honest," he said. "That scares some people." "Yeah," he said. "I can see why." After the show, they walked. It was late November, cold enough that their breath made clouds in the air. The street was quiet, most people already home for the night. They ended up at the beach even though it was freezing. She stopped walking and turned to face the ocean. The wind whipped her hair around. She was quiet for a long time. "Can I tell you something?" she finally said. "Sure. My art is about the difference between what people want and what they let themselves have." She turned to look at him. Most people spend their whole lives wanting things they're too afraid to reach for. He knew she wasn't just talking about art anymore. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" she asked. The question hit him like a physical thing. Before he could answer, his phone rang. His girlfriend's name lit up the screen. She never called outside of Sunday. Something must be wrong, he answered. She was fine. She'd just seen a funny video and wanted to share it with him. They talked for maybe 5 minutes. When he looked up, his neighbor had walked ahead, standing at the edge of the water with her arms wrapped around herself. He caught up to her. "Sorry about that." "Don't be," she said, but something in her voice had changed. They walked back in silence. At their doors, she paused. "Thanks for coming tonight," she said. It meant a lot. "Your work is incredible," he said. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Good night," she said, and disappeared into her apartment. He went into his own apartment and sat in the dark. His phone buzzed. A text from his girlfriend, "Love you." He stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "Love you too." The words felt hollow. For the next 2 days, he avoided his neighbor. He'd hear her door open and he'd wait until she was gone before leaving his apartment. He threw himself into his research, trying to bury himself in work. But on Tuesday night, there was a knock at his door. She stood there looking different. Vulnerable, the confident, challenging person he'd come to know seemed smaller somehow. "I can't sleep," she said quietly. "Can we just sit?" "We don't have to talk. I just don't want to be alone right now." Every rational part of his brain screamed at him to say no, to make up an excuse, to protect the life he'd built, however shaky its foundation. But he stepped aside and let her in. They sat on opposite ends of his couch. The silence was heavy with everything they weren't saying. He could hear the clock ticking on the wall, the distant sound of traffic outside. His heart was beating so hard he was sure she could hear it. 20 minutes passed. Neither of them spoke. The air felt thick, charged with possibility and danger. Then she stood up. He thought she was leaving. He felt this weird mix of relief and crushing disappointment. But she didn't walk to the door. She walked toward his bedroom. He followed, his mind racing. He should stop this. He should say something. But his feet kept moving. She was standing by his bed when he walked in. The lamp on his nightstand cast soft shadows across the room. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Then slowly, deliberately, she reached for the hem of her shirt. Everything slowed down. His brain was screaming at him to stop this, to think about his girlfriend, about the consequences, about all the reasons this was wrong. But his body wouldn't move. He stood frozen, watching her. She didn't rush. Every movement was intentional, clear. This wasn't impulse. This was a choice. When she looked at him, her eyes held this intensity that made everything else disappear. Not seductive, not playful, just certain. Like she was saying without words, "I see you. I choose this. I choose you." His whole body was shaking. He thought about his girlfriend, the promises he'd made, the future they'd planned, the person he was supposed to be. But standing in front of him was this woman who'd somehow seen past all his careful walls, who challenged him, who made him feel awake in a way he hadn't felt in years. The weight of the moment crushed down on him. Whatever happened next would define something fundamental about who he was. Not who he pretended to be, not who people thought he should be, but who he actually was when faced with a real choice. Part of him wanted to run, to preserve the safe, organized life he'd built, to protect himself from the mess and complication. But another part of him, a part he'd been ignoring for longer than he wanted to admit, wanted to be honest for once. To stop living in the safe middle ground, to choose something real, even if it meant everything else fell apart. She stood there, unflinching, offering him something terrifying and true, and he had to decide who he was going to be. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, drowning out everything else. Time seemed to stretch and compress at the same time. She stood there, patient and certain, giving him space to make his choice. There was no pressure in her eyes, just clarity. She knew what she wanted. The question was whether he had the courage to be honest about what he wanted too. His mind raced through 1,000 thoughts at once. His girlfriend's face, the promises he'd made, the plans they'd carefully constructed, the safe, predictable future that made sense on paper but felt empty in practice. And then he thought about the last 2 years, how their conversations had become routine, how he felt more lonely in their relationship than he had before they met. How they'd both been going through the motions, too comfortable or too scared to admit that what they had wasn't working anymore. He thought about the last time he'd felt truly seen by someone. The last time he'd had a conversation that made him forget to check his phone. The last time his heart had raced just from someone walking into a room. It had all been with her. The woman standing in front of him right now. She took a small step closer. Not pushing, just present. Her eyes never left his. In that look, he saw everything she was offering. Not just this moment, but honesty, real connection, the courage to want something without apologizing for it. "You're scared," she said softly. Not a question, an observation. He nodded, not trusting his voice. "Me too," she said. "But I'm tired of being scared more than I'm tired of being lonely." Something in those words broke through his paralysis, because that's what he'd been, wasn't it? Lonely. For years, maybe. Surrounded by people, in a relationship, busy with life, but fundamentally alone because nobody really knew him, not even himself. She'd seen him. Really seen him. The parts he showed the world and the parts he kept hidden, and she'd chosen to be here anyway. His hands were shaking when he reached out, not to stop her, just to touch her arm, to confirm she was real, that this moment was actually happening. Her skin was warm under his fingers. She didn't move, just watched him with those dark, steady eyes. "If we do this," he said, his voice rough, "everything changes." "Everything's already changed," she said. "We're just deciding whether to be honest about it." She was right. The line had been crossed weeks ago. Maybe the first night she'd slept on his couch. Maybe the first time they'd had coffee. Maybe the moment he'd first seen her struggling with that canvas in the hallway and felt that spark of interest he'd tried so hard to ignore. This moment wasn't the beginning. It was just the first time they were being truthful about what was already there. He pulled his hand back, not in rejection, but in need to think. "I have to tell her," he said. "My girlfriend. I can't do this without telling her first." She nodded slowly. "I know I wouldn't want you to. But I also can't tell her and then pretend this isn't what I want," he continued, the words tumbling out. "I can't use honesty as permission. I have to make a choice." "So make it," she said simply. And there it was, the moment of truth. No more hiding behind circumstances or timing or distance. Just a choice about who he wanted to be. He thought about his girlfriend one more time. Really thought about her, not the idea of her, or the relationship they were supposed to have. He thought about whether he loved her or just loved the safety of not having to make hard decisions. The answer had been there all along. He'd just been too scared to look at it. "I choose this," he said quietly. "I choose you. I choose being honest even if it means everything falls apart." Something shifted in her expression. Relief, maybe, or recognition. She closed the distance between them, and when she touched his face, her hands were gentle. "No regrets?" she asked. "Probably a lot of regrets," he said honestly. "But not about this. Not about finally being real." What happened next was quiet and intense and nothing like he'd imagined. It wasn't wild or careless. It was deliberate and present and honest in a way that made his chest ache. Every moment felt significant, like they were both fully there in a way that people rarely are. Afterward, they lay in the dark, not speaking. His mind was already racing ahead to tomorrow, to the conversation he'd have, to how his life was about to implode. But for right now, in this moment, he felt more himself than he had in years. She fell asleep eventually, her breathing deep and even. He stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, knowing that dawn would bring consequences he couldn't avoid. But he'd made his choice. And for better or worse, it was his. Not what someone else wanted for him, not the safe option, not the path of least resistance. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he'd chosen based on truth instead of fear. That had to count for something. He woke up to find her already dressed, sitting in the chair by the window. The early morning light made everything look gray and uncertain. She was staring out at the street below, her expression unreadable. When she noticed he was awake, she turned to look at him. "No regrets," she said. Not a question. A statement, but he was drowning in them. Not regret about her, about what they'd shared. That part felt right in a way nothing had felt right in years. The regret was about everything else. About the mess he'd created. About the person he was about to hurt. About who he'd been for so long that he'd let things get this far. "I need to talk to her," he said, sitting up. "Today," she nodded. "I know. I'm going to give you space." She stood, walked to the door, paused. "Whatever happens, I meant what I said. No regrets. You were honest. That matters." Then she was gone, and he was alone with his thoughts. He tried to call his girlfriend 3 times that morning. Each time it went to voicemail. He couldn't leave a message saying what he needed to say. Some conversations had to happen in real time. By the 4th try, she texted, "In a meeting." "Call you tonight?" Tonight, hours away. Hours to sit with what he'd done and what he needed to do. He tried to work on his dissertation. Couldn't focus. Tried to read. The words blurred on the page. He paced his apartment rehearsing what he'd say, but every version sounded hollow or cruel or insufficient. His phone rang at 7. Her name on the screen. His stomach dropped. "Hey," he answered, his voice unsteady. "Sorry I missed your calls," she said. She sounded tired. "Long day. What's up?" Where did he even start? How did you tell someone you'd betrayed them? That you'd been emotionally checked out for months? That you'd met someone else and crossed every line? "We need to talk," he said. Really talk? Something in his tone must have tipped her off. The silence on the other end stretched long. "Okay," she finally said, her voice careful. "About what?" "About us. About whether we're really together or just going through the motions." More silence. Then quietly, "Is there someone else?" His throat closed up. He wanted to lie, to make this easier somehow, but he'd made a choice last night to stop lying. "Yes," he said, "but that's not the whole problem. The problem is us. We haven't been right for a long time and we both know it." He heard her breath catch. "So you cheat on me and then try to make it about our relationship?" "No," he said. "That's not what I'm doing. I'm saying I messed up. I'm saying I should have had this conversation months ago. I'm saying I've been a coward." "You've been a coward," she repeated, and her voice was sharp now, angry. "You've been living your life, meeting someone, doing God knows what. And I've been here thinking we were working towards something. Were we, though?" The question came out before he could stop it. "Really? When's the last time we talked about anything that mattered? When's the last time you actually wanted to see me? And not just felt like you should?" The silence was different now, heavier. "I was going to come visit for Christmas," she said quietly. "I was going to tell you I got a job offer here. In your city. I was going to ask if we should try being in the same place again." The words hit him like a punch. Of all the timing. Of all the things she could have said. "I didn't know," he said weakly. "Of course you didn't know." Her voice cracked. "Because we don't talk anymore. Because we've both been too scared to admit that long distance killed what we had." She was crying now. He could hear it, and it tore at him. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm so sorry. Are you in love with her?" she asked. "This other person?" He thought about it. Really thought about it. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just in love with feeling like myself again. With feeling seen. And I didn't see you." "We didn't see each other," he said. "We saw the people we used to be. The relationship we used to have. Not what it became." She was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier. "I need time to process this. But you're right about one thing. We haven't been good for a long time. I felt it too. I just didn't want to admit we'd failed." "We didn't fail," he said. "We just changed. People change." "That's a nice way of putting it," she said bitterly. "But you still cheated. You still made a choice to betray me instead of being honest." "I know. And I'll have to live with that. But I'm trying to be honest now, even though it's too late." "Yeah," she said. "Too late." That about sums it up. They talked for another hour. It was painful and messy and necessary. By the end, they'd agreed to end things. She said she'd think about whether she wanted to take the job in his city or stay in Boston. She said she needed time before they could talk again. When he hung up, he felt hollowed out. Relief and guilt and grief all mixed together. He sat in his dark apartment for a long time. Then he walked across the hall and knocked on his neighbor's door. She opened it, took one look at his face, and pulled him inside. They sat on her couch and he told her everything. About the conversation, about the job offer, about how he felt like he'd blown up his life and wasn't sure if it was the right choice or just the selfish one. "You were honest," she said when he finished. "It hurts, but it's better than the alternative." "Is it?" he asked. "I destroyed her." "For what, for us? We don't even know what this is." "No," she said carefully. "We don't, and I'm not asking you to know. But you didn't destroy her by being honest. You would have destroyed both of you by keep living a lie." He wanted to believe that. He wasn't sure he did. She took his hand. "I'm not going anywhere. But I also need you to figure out what you want. Not because of me, not because of her. What do you actually want?" It was the same question she'd asked on the beach. And he still didn't have a good answer. The weeks that followed were the hardest of his life. His ex-girlfriend decided to take the job in Boston, staying far away from him and the mess they'd made. They texted occasionally, civil but distant. She told him she was seeing a therapist to work through the betrayal. He was glad. She deserved support he couldn't give. His neighbor gave him space, but they still saw each other. Carefully, slowly, trying to figure out what they were without the forbidden thrill of secret connection. It was harder than he expected. In the light of day, with no relationship to hide from, they had to figure out if what they had was real or just the product of circumstance and loneliness. Some days were good. They'd have coffee and talk for hours, and it felt right. Like they fit together in a way that was natural and easy. Other days were hard. He'd see something that reminded him of his ex, and the guilt would crash over him. Or they'd have a disagreement, and he'd wonder if he'd blown up his life for something that wouldn't last. His neighbor was patient but honest. "I'm not going to be your redemption arc," she told him one night. "I'm not here to make you feel better about your choices. I'm just here being me. You have to decide if that's what you want." Christmas came and went. He spent it alone, which felt appropriate somehow. He needed time to sit with himself, with who he was without someone else defining him. New Year's Eve approached. He didn't make plans. His neighbor mentioned going to a party downtown but didn't invite him. Another test maybe, seeing if he'd be okay on his own. He was doing dishes at 11:30 when someone knocked on his door. He knew who it was before he opened it. She stood in the hallway wearing a dark coat, her hair down, looking at him with those eyes that had started all of this. "I left the party," she said. "It was boring. Everyone was drunk and pretending to have fun." "And you'd rather be here?" "I'd rather be honest," she said. "I came back because this is where I wanted to be. With you. Not because it's exciting or forbidden or easy. Because you see me, and I see you. And that's rare enough to be worth something." He stepped aside and she came in. They sat on the couch. The same couch where this had all started months ago when she'd knocked on his door freezing and asking for help. "I don't know what we're doing," he admitted. "I don't know if this is going to work. I don't know if I'm ready for something real." "Nobody ever knows," she said. "That's the whole point. You take the risk anyway." Outside, fireworks started going off. They could hear people cheering in the streets. A new year beginning. "I'm tired of being safe," he said. "I'm tired of choosing comfort over truth." "So what do you want?" she asked. The same question she always asked. The question he'd been avoiding his whole life. He looked at her. Really looked at her. Not the fantasy or the escape or the catalyst for change. Just her. Complicated and real and uncertain. "I want to try," he said. "I want to see what this could be if we're both honest about it. No games, no hiding, just real." She smiled. Not triumphant. Just soft and genuine. "Okay," she said. "Let's be real." They sat there as midnight passed, not kissing dramatically or making grand declarations. Just sitting together, holding hands, being present. He thought about his ex-girlfriend and hoped she was finding peace. He thought about the life he'd had, structured and safe and slowly suffocating him. He thought about all the versions of himself he'd tried to be to make other people happy. And he thought about this moment. Uncertain and scary and real. "I'm glad you knocked on my door that night," he said quietly, when the heat was out. "Me too," she said, "even though it complicated everything." "Maybe we needed complicated," he said. "Maybe we did." The fireworks continued outside. People celebrated and made resolutions they probably wouldn't keep. Another year turning over, full of possibility and risk. He didn't know what would happen tomorrow, whether they'd last or crash and burn, whether he'd made the right choice or just traded one set of problems for another. But for the first time in years, he wasn't trying to predict the future or control the outcome. He was just here in this moment being honest about what he wanted. That night hadn't been the end of his old life or the beginning of a new one. It had been the moment he finally stopped running from himself. The moment he chose truth over comfort, even knowing the cost. She leaned her head on his shoulder. He put his arm around her. Outside, the city celebrated. Inside, two people sat in the quiet, being real with each other, figuring out what came next. And that was enough.